Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe to develop campaign strategies, train engagement staff in leadership and power building, and help you execute your campaign with data-driven tactics and actions. And in 2022, or what's left of it, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Morris Blackburn Lawyers. Morris Blackburn Lawyers have the experience you need on your side when something goes wrong. They know the law inside and out and will explain every detail without legal jargon so you feel comfortable and fully understand your situation. They know how the system works and have expertise and resources to continue standing up for clients on matters where others may give up. Find out more by visiting their website, morrisblackburn.com.au. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast, out every Friday. And apologies, obviously this is coming in on a Monday morning. We just had a bit of a challenge with this week's guest. It was a bit crook. And obviously we're doing this with the challenge of different time zones. So those windows to record sometimes can be a bit of a challenge. But anyway, we got there in the end and we want to make sure we got this episode out to you guys. So these episodes dive into the progressive campaign issues of the day and people leading them from home and abroad. And obviously I said it, abroad today we're going back to Dublin, the land of my fathers. We're having a chat to David Kitching. He's been on the show before. We had him on the show in March where he talked about the complexities of Brexit and how that impacts the Good Friday Agreement and the border between Ireland and the six counties and the border between the relationship between Britain and Ireland and the relationship between the six counties and Britain. Got him back on the show today just to talk about what's going on in the UK. It's been chaos for the last 6 or 7 months, and I thought I'd get Dave on to have a bit of a yak about all the things that's happening in the UK. Also to note that this Thursday we're recording our first of 4 weekly episodes to unpack the week that was in the Victorian state election campaign, and I'm going to be joined by the Executive Director for Per Capita, the progressive think tank, Emma Dawson, and the former federal member for Batman and a former party secretary here in Victoria for the Labor Party, David Feeney. You'll recall in the lead up to the federal election, I had those two wonderful people on the show each week to unpack the federal election campaign. Well, we're going to do it all again, but we're going to do it for the Victorian state election, which is on Saturday, the 26th of November. It's not far away at all. So each week, David, Emma and myself will basically go through what happened that week in terms of where the leaders went, in terms of campaign announcements, in terms of campaign materials like ads, polls, if there are debates, how do they go? If there are campaign launches, how do they go? What are we learning from all the sort of the colour and movement of the political campaign, as well as the media, how are they covering it as well? So look forward to doing those episodes with the guys again. So look out for that. They'll be out every Friday morning, all the way up until Election Day. Plus we'll do one after Election Day as well. We'll do a sort of a post-campaign wrap. And I think we'll also do another campaign episode where we go through all of the key battleground seats that Labor needs to hold or pick up new ones in order to get to 45 seats that ensures that they have another 4 years of government in Victoria. So look out for that next week. This week, looking forward to recording that first of 4 episodes with Emma and David. And if you like the show, don't forget to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast and on Spotify when you're done listening to today's episode, or leave us a review on Apple Podcast. And for all the updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Sunday evening on the land of the Wurundjeri people. Podcast on a Sunday on the Sabbath. That's how committed we are to getting you guys the best topics and conversations from around the world Joining me on the line from Dublin, actually, speaking of around the world, we've had him on the show before. He's the managing director for Baseline Strategies, which is a consultancy on campaigns and advocacy. He's also the chair of the international section of the Labour Party in Ireland. David Kitching, Fulcher Oresh to Social Democratic.
Hi, Stephen. Good to see you again.
Absolutely. Now, the last time I saw you, I think you and I were having a pint in Keogh's in Dublin on a glorious Sunday afternoon over the summer.
Yeah, the sun really came out for us that day. It was good to see you in person as well, finally.
It was indeed. Probably had one too many pints from memory because I think I had a bit of we had meetings early Monday morning and I don't think I was as sharp as I needed to be. But anyway, it's great to have you back on the show. Once again, we're going to, the last time you were on the show, we kind of really talked about Irish politics and the border and the relationship with the UK, and it was a great chat. And I think you and I actually then spoke for about another hour after we finished recording. And I wanted to get you back on the show this time to talk about UK politics. Obviously, a lot has happened in the last couple of months, and we haven't had a chance to go back to the UK and have a bit of an analysis of what's going on politically. I actually like the idea of having an Irishman come on and talk about UK politics as opposed to the other way around. Normally get British people to talk about Irish politics. So let's talk about our former colonial masters and what they're up to and how they're really fucking it up. So let's dive in because there's so much to cover since we last spoke. You know, the Tories have now had 3 leaders within a year. This follows sort of a growing line of resignations from the prime ministership of the British government. You know, David Cameron resigned after Brexit in 2016. Theresa May resigned 3 years later. Boris Johnson resigned following a string of controversies, and then we've had Truss resign, who was in the job for like less than 50 days. The Great Resignation, I knew that was applying to people working in sort of transient jobs, but I didn't think it was going to be for also the top job in Britain. Can we go back to the resignation of Boris Johnson, first of all, in the first place? Because he has his landslide victory against Jeremy Corbyn. And you kind of got the impression at that moment that the Tories were settled in and locked in for at least 2 terms with him at the helm. What the hell happened in which we see Boris Johnson have to resign?
Yeah, it's been pretty bizarre, to be honest. You're watching from any vantage point, from talking to people within the UK or looking from the point of view of someone in Ireland or within the European Union, trying to seek a serious partner. And I kind of couldn't believe when I looked back at when we had our previous conversation. That was just the end of March. I thought it was much longer ago before I looked, because so much has happened since then. And I remember saying to you at the time that we don't have a serious partner in the UK. If you'd spoken to me 2 years before that, that would have been the case as well. And it has just gone from bad to worse. Even going back to like David Cameron started all of this, where he had presented himself as this kind of liberal conservative who was a centralizing force, but he never had the guts to face down the far right of his party. And then he was followed by Theresa May, who presented herself as kind of a nice and more serious face of it, but a lot of her political standing was pretty vacuous. And she also she had options. She could have gone for a less extreme version of Brexit. The customs union and single market were still on the table, but she also decided to kowtow to the far right of the party, and she came out with these kind of empty phrases like red, white, and blue Brexit, and she was just floundering, and she was never going to keep them happy, but she was always a prisoner to them. And ultimately, you had Boris Johnson in the wings, just having his fun. He's not a serious person, but he's effective at certain things. At disruption, at causing trouble, and serving himself. And ultimately, he managed to get himself into number 10 Downing Street. And at a time when the pandemic hit and it masked a lot of the worst effects of Brexit in terms of the impact on the economy. So he's able to hide behind that for a while doing atrocious damage in terms of the health of the British population, the manner in which he administered the lockdowns, the chaos around it. so going from that huge landslide victory in 2019, where he managed to break through for Tories in areas where they never really had a footprint, and the extent to which he let people down, and the emergence of kind of stories of corruption in terms of how deals were struck for supplies of personal protective equipment, the mismanagement of the economy and of various schemes intended to stimulate it, the kind of callous treatment of healthcare workers and of patients within the hospital. He'd already set the scene, whereby he'd lost a huge amount of trust, and then the frivolous stuff starts happening, but in a really serious context. So the idea that they were always constantly on constantly partying in Number 10 while other people were being told to stay at home, like it just sounded like they were mostly on the lash, like, while running, while holding serious office, and he's constant stories of like of people messing things up because they were at a party. Like even going, this stayed on into Liz Truss's time. There's a story going around about her wanting a blow dry before an appearance, or before a meeting she was due to have in New York, and the aide that was tasked with organizing a hairdresser to come to her hotel room had forgotten because he'd gone on the lash in New York and was seen hugging a toilet bowl. You're dealing with like college students who hold high office effectively, and that's not being fair to college students. uh, so it's a really bizarre vista, because like they'd always held themselves up, like the British Conservatives, I mean, as the sensible party, as the as natural inheritors of the right to govern and all of this. It's all based on such flimsy, self-serving rhetoric, really, because you see they believe their own lies, they believe their own rubbish, and it's really strange to watch this. And looking at Liz Truss, you know, like I got married just a few weeks ago, and in another couple of weeks I'll have been married longer than she was prime minister.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. But it's a really strange thing. It doesn't feel like I've been married that long.
Yeah.
But it's really strange to watch all of this, and that kind of fixed term parliament act they brought in some years ago as well has been hugely damaging, because in any normal circumstance they would have gone for an election by now.
I mean, that's interesting, right? So Johnson resigns, leaving
Yeah.
this leadership vacuum to fill.
Yeah.
And the options available to the Tory party, the party of government, would be to either find a consensus candidate in which there is no need to have a ballot, or go down the path of having a ballot, which requires the entire membership to vote on, which takes time. They've obviously opted. I'm assuming they can't find a consensus candidate. They opt for this latter, having a massive election across their membership, which creates a sort of uncertainty for a long time. Who the hell's running the country while they're trying to sort their shit out and have an election? Talk to us about the internal fault lines inside the Conservative Party that saw them go down this path of an internal ballot as opposed to seeking a consensus candidate.
Yeah, I suppose the first past the post electoral system, it really masks a lot of undercurrents within both main parties, to be honest. Um, in a continental European democracy, or in Ireland for that matter, the Tory party the Conservatives would be two or three parties really, and so would the Labour Party. Where you'd have probably your traditional social democratic centre left party, and you'd have a more left of centre socialist party. I suppose if you're to compare Corbyn and Starmer would represent either entity. In the Tories, it's more complicated again. So you have the traditionalist one Tory grouping, which ultimately Johnson's leadership pushed it aside, but they're the more centrist, try to be more inclusive. There's a sense of paternalism in them, a bit of noblesse oblige, but they don't tend to be overly radical. They're more pragmatic. Then you have this kind of very aggressive neoliberal element who, represented by what Liz Truss tried to do, very much oriented around supply side economics, belief in deregulation and low taxation as a way to stimulate the economy. You have the more ultra-nationalist grouping, and they would be, some of them are quite similar to the UK Independence Party or the Brexit Party in their orientation, often verging on xenophobic in terms of rhetoric. You've seen that recently in the likes of Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, and her whole discourse around immigration. Very aggressive, nationalist, and obviously very Eurosceptic. Both the truss kind of Thatcherite or supply side economics grouping and the latter more nationalistic set, they both tend to be quite Eurosceptic for different but overlapping reasons. They want to be free of the regulation of the European Union, but they also don't like the multilateralism it represents and the kind of pooling of sovereignty. So, in a continental European democracy, it would be very hard for all of those to sit together in one party, because of what the voting system means, that you have to form these pre-made coalitions within the party, and it's hard to get around that. So it means when you've got one grouping in the ascendant, a leader might try and have others represented in the cabinet, or they might just decide to go full on and serve their own interests or their own ideological base.
Talk us through then. So Truss comes from this neoliberal wing of the Conservative Party. She nominates as one of the candidates, and she runs against Sunak. Where does he hail from in terms of his internal grouping within the party?
Yeah, so Sunak is like, I'm still trying to figure Sunak out at a lot of levels. Like he voted for Brexit. He supported Brexit, and he went along with all of that, and he was he was chancellor under Boris Johnson. Now Johnson, in terms of those kind of wings, Johnson's just a more cynical populist, and there is a large grouping of them too, who will do what it takes to attain power. Sunak managed to cultivate a reputation of being more sensible and competent, and in a more maybe traditional conservative framework. Now, whether that is the case is not quite clear to me yet. It's the classic thing of, if you get a reputation for waking early in the morning, you can sleep in the rest of your life. And he's possibly cultivated a good narrative for himself, but then he presided over some pretty shambolic outcomes while Chancellor. A lot of those deals that went for the provision of equipment or particular services, had a very detrimental effect. Or there was one, for example, Eat Out to Help Out, where they tried to stimulate the service economy, the kind of food, the hospitality industry, but it also caused the pandemic, caused the coronavirus to spread a lot more quickly than it would have otherwise. So he's had things backfire on him, but it hasn't managed to stick to him to the same degree. And then, if you look at the race between himself and Liz Truss, just a couple of months ago, really, he did play a more sensible game than she did in terms of his approach to the economy and to how they would, in terms of where they would stand, where she was far more ideological, and that appealed, of course, to the Tory membership, who would be inherently more ideological than the broader population. When it comes to Brexit and relations with the EU, it's harder to say. So, like I said, he supported Brexit ostensibly, but he hadn't been hugely vocal about it previously. But then, in the kind of run sheet you sent over, there was this one piece on him pulling out of COP27, and at the same time, he is having a separate discussion in Buckingham Palace with King Charles, related to climate change. So this would make me wonder where does he stand when it comes to multilateralism? He hasn't been overly vocal on what he wants to do when it comes to the European Union and the Northern Ireland Protocol and any kind of subsequent arrangements. But he's also pulling in from British involvement in significant multilateral movements and organisations. He also, if you look at some of the people he's picked for the cabinet, like the idea that he picked someone like Suella Braverman as Home Secretary after she had resigned in the last week of the Truss administration because of violation of the ministerial code, and she's also someone who's aggressively anti-immigrant in her rhetoric. I would say dangerously so, to be quite honest, because it sets a precedent that normalizes nasty xenophobic rhetoric. So I'm not quite sure whether Sunak is such a known quantity. We know his background in terms of his career, and he's career in Goldman Sachs. He is, for the first time, the family in 10 Downing Street is wealthier than the royal family. You're talking about enormous, like, plutocratic level wealth. But as a politician, he's cultivated an image for competence and being sensible and being the one who tried to rein Boris Johnson in, and being the one who wasn't held on by Liz Truss because he didn't adhere to her kind of ideological zealotry. But I suppose the proof will be in the pudding as to how he plays out.
So going back a little bit, why did Liz Truss win the election for the leadership of the Conservative Party over Sunak?
Well, she was able to appeal to a particular ideological trend that still remains popular within the Conservative membership. She had started this, I think it was a free trade group or something like that, or a free enterprise group, back in, I think, 2010 or 2011, and a lot of MPs were members of it. It was couched as a Thatcherite group, and there's a good degree of nostalgia amongst a lot of Conservatives as to how Margaret Thatcher ran her government and what she did in terms of shifting UK society and the economy. So she played to that particular kind of base, and she ran a highly ideological campaign. However, when it came to actual implementation, she and her first chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, who only lasted a few weeks really, they were implementing tax cuts on the wealthy, which are funded through borrowing. Now, that kind of thing eventually makes Conservatives nervous, because there's no kind of cohesive justification for that. Like from an ideological base, now I don't agree with it personally, but from their point of view, there's a logic in lowering taxation because I think it'll overall stimulate the economy. But to do that through borrowing and through increasing the overall cost of the exchequer, that's not very recognisably Conservative either, and it spooked the markets and and the bond yields, and it very rapidly had an impact on people's pocketbook. It increased interest rates on mortgages very quickly. You had the government doing one thing and the Bank of England doing another, and at odds. It just all looked like chaos. It looked like incompetence and an effort to fulfill an ideological desire that had no basis in anything pragmatic.
I mean, talk about that. Yeah, you mentioned the Bank of England there. They stepped in. Talk about what they did, why they needed to do it, and how significant that was, and the impacts it had on ultimate leadership.
It's a really strange thing when you see Bank of England trying to calm markets that are being disrupted by governmental intervention, and so from voters' point of view, from markets' point of view, it just looked like chaos. And I can't think of the exact name of the term. Is it the moron dividend or the more. There's something that they talk about within financial services that is ultimately based on the response of the markets to someone doing something stupid, and like the idea that can happen within a few weeks of your premiership, it's pretty terrifying. When you think about how much effort somebody goes through in a career to reach that pinnacle of politics, to hold that office, and within a few weeks, all of the adults in the room end up having to intervene so that you don't kind of spill your breakfast on yourself. It was pretty like alarming to watch.
What the bit I didn't, I mean, as I said to you before we started recording, I mean, I've been a bit busy in my own life and I really haven't had a chance to really deep dive into it. So I'm super interested when I'm asking these questions. I'm actually asking these questions because I don't know the answer to these questions. Why did she not see it out? Why did she just fall on her sword? What happened within the party that she sort of said, I can't sustain this? Because she's elected by the membership. Now,
Yeah.
if I was a member of the Conservative Party caucus and I was trying to agitate for change, if I was Liz Truss, I'd say back to them, well, I've got the mandate from our membership and you can get as many numbers as you like in caucus, but it's the people that voted for me. So if you want to roll me, you're going to have to get you're going to have to get enough votes in caucus to then have a spill of the leadership and everyone vote again. And sometimes that can be a hurdle too big to climb for someone within caucus, right? So I don't understand why she didn't lean on that and try and hold out. What happened that she just went, oh, you know what? I'm done.
Yeah, it's a funny kind of setup they have within their party. So because she had that support from the membership, in theory they couldn't have you couldn't have a confidence vote in her for I think something like 18 months. However, such was the degree of worry in terms of the effect that she and the chancellor were having on the economy, that it got the MPs spooked. And if there comes a point where people are not willing to work with you any longer, no matter what, she still needs the parliamentary party to be able to work with her and people to be willing to serve as a minister. And so there had already been letters of concern written to the chair of the 1922 committee, which represents backbenchers, but also when resignation started to come in, and there was quite a funny thing that was going around during the week. You've seen the thick of it, I presume.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah. There was a snippet from that was going around, that Malcolm Tucker talking to one of the ministers.
In the back of the car.
Yeah. So where he goes, you're not going to get sacked after a week. If you get sacked after a year, it looks like you messed up. If you get sacked after a week, it looks like the PM messed up. And the fact that she was, within a few weeks, she had to sack Kwasi Kwarteng, even though she had signed off on the mini budget that he had put in place, and it very much reflected her perspective too. And he's one of her closest friends in politics until that point. And so that she threw him under the bus and appointed Jeremy Hunt, who still remains Chancellor under Rishi Sunak and is seen again as a more sensible politician than Kwasi Kwarteng. Now it's all relative because Hunt has had his own problems, but she already had to do that and roll back on her ambitious plans. And then other things started happening. So Suella Braverman was caught out for violating the ministerial code. She'd basically been breaking confidentiality rules of cabinet. She was emailing a backbench MP through a Gmail account. Details that happened at cabinet. She made a mistake where she emailed the wrong person, who was an assistant of another MP, and then it all got out.
Always happens. Always
Yeah,
happens.
yeah. And she got so she ultimately had to resign too. But she also, in her letter of resignation, she gave a scathing message as to the chaos and the mess that was going on. It was starting to just chip away at her and at Liz Truss. I mean, and you had Michael Gove coming out against the mini budget, saying that this is not something that's recognisably conservative. Like I was saying earlier, when you have to borrow to fund tax cuts, you can't make any justification for that and still consider the Conservatives to be this kind of sensible party of government. So all of these elements worked against her, and effectively, when the other MPs were no longer willing to work with her on that basis, she decided to finally fall on her sword, and she was fairly unapologetic in terms of how she approached this. She just basically said that she no longer has the ability to deliver the mandate on which she was elected. She didn't question the mandate, and this kind of untested ideological approach that has finally been tested and failed abominably. Didn't question that. She still was quite holding to her guns on that. She just basically said that, yeah, her party wouldn't work with her any longer on this, and she just moved on. And Sunak came in shortly thereafter. There was a little bit of will he, won't he about a couple, and will she, won't she about a couple of others. Boris Johnson was talked about as potentially running again for leadership, and Penny Mordaunt, but ultimately they both pulled out before it came to a proper race. They weren't really they weren't getting enough nominations anyway to be able to run. But in the end, Sunak just was handed the leadership.
Okay. So I see he's announced his cabinet, and it appears to be very much a boys' club, despite the scrutiny the last administration faced on that particular issue. I think 1 in 5 ministers are women. What type of leader do we expect Sunak to be?
Yeah, yes, I suppose there was a good deal of discussion around the representation and diversity of his cabinet. Sunak, like you were saying, just 1 in 5 are women, and they have been in significant offices of state, but at the same time, in 2022, it's pretty poor showing. That I think 7 out of the total of 31. In terms of ethnic diversity, something like 16% of the cabinet are from BAME communities, which is slightly higher than the broader population. And it is significant. That for the first time, someone from Indian background is prime minister, from Hindu faith as well. And that's
David, for the Australian audience, you might need to explain the acronym that you just mentioned.
Oh yeah, so it's Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, so that has been significant. There are a few other indicators as to the representativeness of his cabinet. Now, the majority of the cabinet were privately educated. I think so, just over 52% or something like that. Now, that compares to 7% of the overall population. And even within that, a very significant portion of the male ministers within it went to Eton. And then a huge amount of them, in terms of the third level education, went to Oxford or Cambridge. So you're taking a pretty narrow portion of the population. And it's something that has been an issue over many years in UK politics. The dominance of particularly Oxford's politics, philosophy and economics course, and the number of people in high office or in advisory roles who've come from that specific course is sort of reflective of that kind of finishing school that people talk about in France, like the École Nationale Administrative. It sort of served as a proxy for that within the UK, but it also, and while the quality of instruction and education might be really high, if the pool you're drawing from is that narrow, it can create issues in terms of blind spots with regard to what people are dealing with outside of those milieu. So he's so in terms of that the kind of government he's going to run, I would be concerned that it would be pretty out of touch. And even, well, Boris Johnson obviously also went to Eton and Oxford. Um, he at least talked a big game on levelling up and on making inroads amongst like what they call the red wall constituencies in the north of England. The representativeness of Sunak's cabinet, there are very few from the northeast. From northeast constituencies. From London, I don't think there are any MPs from London in the cabinet. Um, yeah, so it's pretty narrow, south and southeast of England cabinet in terms of its representation as well. So regionally and in class and education terms, it's very narrow. It's got very few women compared to what you would expect in 2022. It's uh, it's done okay in terms of broader ethnic representation and made some inroads there. But I would worry that the economic and regional focus will be quite narrow.
Then sticking with that question about the economy, I think we're all of us looking at the UK at the moment. Economically, it looks like a basket case. When I was there
Yeah,
in the summer, if Heathrow Airport is a metaphor for the UK economy, then it's it's in a world of trouble. What do we what what are we getting from Sunak's uh, embryonic days as a leader in terms of the way that he seeks to repair the UK economy going forward in this sort of this continual post Brexit kind of where the hell are we kind of like this? Remember Johnson was talking about creating Singapore on the Thames.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
is, yeah, is this dream still happening? I mean, where are they? Like, where do you think Sunak's going to take them?
Yeah, like so far he's trying to just retake the narrative after the chaos of the truss experiment. Um, so he's prioritizing stability. He wants to look like he's a reliable, sensible prime minister, and effectively avoid spooking the markets. And so that seems to be the immediate focus. Where I would have concern now is that what that will mean and what it will take especially from a conservative prime minister's perspective, what it will take to pacify the markets. I would be very concerned, especially for more deprived communities in the UK, that this is going to mean Osborne Mark II, where you're going to have aggressive austerity. And we know the communities that will affect most and will affect first. Um, Sunak already has some form from when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in terms of, there was a recording found of him speaking in Tunbridge Wells in Kent, which would be fairly conservative constituency, looking at how he changed the rules on certain types of public funding that would shift it from deprived urban areas towards constituencies like Tunbridge Wells. So basically, constituencies that were more conservative voting and more well heeled. So he already has some form in that anyway. He doesn't seem to believe in a particularly generous welfare state, and there's possibly a degree of moral judgment in terms of how he approaches that. But the narrative he's creating is one of just being a sensible guy who isn't a total mess like Johnson or Truss. So, as the saying goes, like Johnson was feckless, Truss was reckless, and he's just trying to be an antidote to that.
Look, it's interesting to think about some of the immediate challenges on top of the economic challenge that you've just spoken about, and some of it's domestic and some of it's regional. Obviously, the relationship that Britain has now with Europe, continental Europe. Also, the challenge that he will face now because there is strong agitation by the Scottish nationalists to have another referendum on whether or not Scotland will remain a part of the United Kingdom. And then he's got a problem on the Irish Sea in terms of the protocol as well.
Yeah,
You mentioned before, like he's not even going to go to COP in Egypt in next this month or next month. What do you get a sense from him in terms of how he's going to approach some of those issues that I've just raised, either Europe, Scotland, or the North?
yeah. So on Europe first, I would have a concern, and I don't know if COP is representative of this, but if he's pulling away from coherent multilateral engagement, that is, to me, a signal that we have something to worry about in all of these other areas too. Because if it's something that, like, you can't address climate action concerns without coordination and without multilateralism and collaboration. So if he's pulling away from that and just having the UK do its own thing, it already shows a lack of a commitment to actually dealing with it in a meaningful way. With the EU, again, he just hasn't been clear enough, on where he stands and what he wants to do in terms of the relationship. If he's going to continue with the narrative that he's done so in economic terms of being the sensible guy who just wants to calm everything down, that might translate into how he approaches the EU and just wants to get on with things. He hasn't been hugely vocal in terms of where he stands and on what the agreement should follow. When it comes to Northern Ireland, he's maintained Chris Heaton-Harris as the Northern Ireland Secretary. Now, the kind of sideshow to what's been happening within the Conservative Party is that for some months now, there's been a failure to form an executive in Northern Ireland. There were assembly elections some months ago, and Sinn Féin emerged as the largest party for the first time. And following that, the DUP has been refusing to engage in terms of their obligations to set up an executive. DUP, for your listeners, the Democratic Unionist Party. So they're the largest party of unionism. They've had a very problematic role since 2016 and before when it comes to how they've been engaged with the Tories around Brexit. They've played a sort of a spoiler role. They campaigned for something that was really detrimental to Northern Ireland, both communities, by the way. They really sold a lot of their own voters down the Swanee. And now they're refusing to play ball in terms of their obligations under the Good Friday Agreement to participate in the executive. There are a few ways of looking at it. One is that they don't want to serve under a Sinn Féin First Minister. But their justification for it is that until the Northern Ireland Protocol has been fixed from their point of view, they will not participate in any executive. This was about to precipitate a new assembly election in Northern Ireland. It was going to take place in December. Now, Chris Heaton-Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary, has intervened and he's postponed that, and they may bring in legislation that allows for a little bit more breathing space, because otherwise there would have to be an election by mid-January at least, or at the latest. So he's trying to create some breathing space. It's showing a degree of pragmatism within the Northern Ireland office as to how they should approach this. That they're not just kowtowing to what the Democratic Unionist Party wants, which had been a problem under Theresa May and under Johnson. What's been interesting as well within the Northern Ireland office is the mood music. So I mentioned earlier Steve Baker. He's a junior minister in the Northern Ireland office now. But prior to that, and he was appointed by Liz Truss, but he was maintained by Sunak. Prior to that, Steve Baker, he was a leading light in the European Research Group, which is a very influential Eurosceptic group within the Conservative Party. And he's always been one of the most aggressive Brexiteers within the Conservatives. He always sort of held the leaders' feet to the fire in terms of them having to satisfy Brexiteers' needs. And has historically been very aggressive. As soon as he was appointed to that office, he began speaking in very, very different terms. He issued a very heartfelt apology to Ireland, to the European Union, about how he had often showed a lack of understanding of the dynamics within Northern Ireland and of all that was at play. So it was a very interesting moment because he was not someone who's considered a very reflective person, but it's not just the content, but also the tone. And he really
Where's this come from, Dave?
I don't know, like maybe he clearly is a very ideological person, but I guess when you see the impact of the Good Friday Agreement on the ground and the kind of suffering that it helped to eliminate in Northern Ireland, um, for a long time, a lot of the discourse within Britain. I lived in London when the Brexit referendum happened. They didn't talk about Ireland or Northern Ireland at all. It just didn't feature. When someone brought it up, it was considered a sideshow. Let's not distract from the real issues. But it always was going to be the real issue. It was obvious to anyone who grew up on this side of the Irish Sea. So they didn't want uh, Northern Ireland to get in the way of their broader British nationalist dream of securing their version of sovereignty and so-called independence from the European Union. But I guess when he's given responsibility for a role within the Northern Ireland office, I guess to be fair to him, I guess he's taken that seriously and realised that he does have a responsibility to try and uphold the peace that has been brought with the Good Friday Agreement, and not to stir the pot so much. So and I heard an interview recently with another a colleague of his who was kind of floundering because he'd spoken on both sides of the Brexit debate and so many times, and he described um, he described Steve Baker as a reflective person, or it's very sincere, and the implication was that the person speaking himself was not so sincere, but maybe there is a degree of sincerity in spite. Like he's clearly he's a radical Brexiteer, and he's a a British unionist, or like a nationalist in those terms. Um, but I guess there may be a degree of sincerity in terms of actually trying to help the situation.
And of Scotland, what have we sort of seen from the SNP in terms of the new Prime Minister, the relationship that Nicola Sturgeon is forging with the new government? They're obviously very adamant to wanting to have a referendum as soon as they possibly can.
Yeah, yeah. Like from their point of view, it has really gone from bad to worse. Like they didn't manage to make it over the line in terms of their first go at an independence referendum, and that was in a way that you know David Cameron's government winning that referendum probably emboldened him to think that he read the public well enough when it came to the Brexit one as well. Um, but every move within Westminster ever since then has has just made things more and more anxiety inducing north of the border in Scotland. Because they're dragged out of the European Union when a significant majority of them voted to stay. And then when it comes to the machinations of the British government, around COVID-19, around Liz Truss's economic adventurism, that even though it only lasted a month and a half, it still leaves a legacy, and it has a damaging effect on all of the regions within the UK, even if there is a degree of autonomy that the Scottish Parliament has. How things will play out internally in Scotland, it's kind of hard to say, because we've had these occasional surges of, a few years ago, the Scottish Tories managed to make some inroads, and Labour have been significantly weakened. But we don't know how things will play out in the long run, because as polling nationally kind of shows these various surges in Labour and reductions in the Conservatives. It's a very volatile situation, and there may be some constituencies where Labour can make some comebacks, but it won't be significant enough to be a game changer either. So yeah, there's a lot going on there, and it's very kind of hard to it's very hard to predict whether they will be given an opportunity, because again, Truss and Johnson had said they would not be willing to endorse a referendum. I haven't heard Sunak comment on this yet, but usually when it comes to dealing with the Tory electorate, the membership, they would usually take a unionist position. So I don't know will they be given that opportunity the way they were under Cameron's premiership. But I can't see them pulling back from advocating for it for a while now.
I mean, it's certainly if I was Sunak and I allowed another referendum to occur, geez, you think that the SNP or the Nationalists would be red hot to probably win this one. I mean, if I was the SNP or the Nationalist campaign, I'd run a campaign based on, vote to join the bigger union. I mean, I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
that,
yeah,
do you know what I mean?
yeah.
Like anecdotally thinking about my family back in Scotland, the younger members of my clan all voted to leave
Mhm.
the union. Maybe some of the older ones are a bit more cautious on that kind of stuff, but
Yeah,
even now they've flipped as well, and they're like, Westminster's a basket case,
yeah,
and we'd rather either go on our own and stuff it up ourselves, or go on our own and actually join, go back in and join the European Union again. So it's an interesting thing for Sunak to sort of
yeah,
negotiate. But at the same time, if you're very politically pragmatic, getting rid of all of those seats makes it so much harder for the Labor Party to get back in as well.
yeah. It does. It's. I suppose it's two separate views of pragmatism, isn't it? So like you can secure, well, a strong Tory representation for the foreseeable, or you could be viewed as the prime minister who finally gave up the
On
union.
the union. Yeah,
And
interesting.
that's probably not where you want to be seen in the history books either, especially if you're conservative.
We're in this we're in this post-Trump era now because anything is possible.
Yeah,
Any
yeah,
crazy idea really can get floated and probably be run with, right? I don't
oh,
think ever we
completely,
thought
yeah,
that we would leave I don't think we ever thought Britain would leave the European Union in the first place, but here we are.
yeah. And like the dynamics within Scotland, you know, they can change too. Like the SNP has been in the ascendant for so long now, and that comes with problems eventually too. There will be things that they mess up in terms of in terms of regional government, um, and there can be a level of fatigue that sets in. And also, I suppose with the independence referendum, one thing I found really interesting back then was the kind of the potential swing vote, which was which is essentially Labour voting Catholics in Scotland, um, were a really interesting swing vote, because historically they had often voted against independence, because they felt better protected in a broader in the broader UK. But that kind of sectarian mindset has vastly moved on, and it's not really an issue anymore. So it got close because more of those previously Labour voting Catholic background voters are willing and were willing to consider independence. And that's only increasing in the years since.
Yeah, and that when you say protection, David, for our audiences that are not familiar with internal Scottish cultural and political divides, obviously there's been historical tensions between the Scots Presbyterian establishment and I guess the Irish diaspora, which is my family, Donnellys and Mullins and
Yeah,
everyone else that sort of settled in the west of Scotland. Let's quickly turn before we wrap up to talk about Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the
yeah,
Labor Party. The Labor Party must be. I had John McTiernan on the show. I can't remember when, at some stage this year, and we were sort of talking. In fact, he was out in Australia earlier in the year, and we caught up for dinner. And I was sort of saying to him, how do you think Labor's doing, and what are their chances? And he was at that time thinking, well, in the next election, they can go close. They can win back a lot of those seats that they lost under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, and then be in a position for the election after that to get back in, or maybe best chance minority government with maybe an SNP, Lib Dems, whatever. But looking
yeah,
at the polling now, even going back as far as when Johnson was leader, Labor's polling well, and now I'm just pull up my notes again. The current polls, the YouGov poll that was in late October, has Labor on 51%,
yeah.
the Conservatives on 23%, Lib Dems on 9%. I mean, these are good numbers for Keir and Labor folks.
Yeah, they are. It's not like anything I've seen before, especially in the UK system. It's one thing that I have a little bit of a discomfort in terms of making any assumptions off the back of it now, because they're soft figures, like they're based on utter chaos under Johnson and a different type of utter chaos under Truss. So it's hard to know what will happen now. I worry that Starmer is not telling his own story or telling Labour's own story enough. From what I'm seeing strategically is that a lot of what he's doing is just defining him against something else. So he's against the kind of the chaos of Johnson, the kind of fecklessness and incompetence, and he's a person of integrity and competence in as an antidote to that. He's a kind of sensible guy in response to the zealotry and the ideological mess that that Truss has created, and even within the party that he's the guy who's not Corbyn. Like I would worry that if Sunak manages to satisfy certain needs within that kind of persuadable population in the middle, that Starmer might not know where to go with this. And if you're just going around triangulating based on where you think the population is at vis-a-vis somebody else, I think it's just risky in the long run. I would like to see him tell his story and have a stance, because otherwise he'll start to look slippery. He's got quite a compelling personal story, and you wouldn't think it from the way they present him. He's a guy from working class background, worked his way up, doing some very impressive legal work in the human rights sector, and then has worked his way up to be head of the Crown Prosecution Service at a pretty young age, and went into politics for the right reasons. He's done a lot. He's really had quite an impressive career in law and politics, and yet we're dealing a lot with just the sensible guy who's not Johnson, who's not Truss, who's not Corbyn, who's not Sunak. I think the public needs to see more of who he is, and it hasn't always been helped by he's occasionally spoken out of both sides of his mouth on particular issues. Happened on with regard to Brexit. He was the one who moved the Labour Party under Corbyn. He moved them away from an outright Brexit supporting position, but then as leader himself, he's ruled out turning back the tide on Brexit. He got caught out recently as well on giving two different versions of his positioning on transgender issues, and in terms of how those rights are upheld or administered. And then I think there's been probably a lack of leadership when it comes to discourse around immigration as well. So I mentioned earlier the very kind of coarse discourse coming from the Conservative Party, in particular Suella Braverman. The kind of terminology she's using towards people trying to come to the UK has been frankly disgusting. And the Labour Party hasn't been that strong in terms of countering that. It's been often indulgent, and so I think that there's a need for the Labour Party to have its narrative and be clear about it, and not just defined against what it is not.
I guess if I can put a counter argument to you on that one, and I certainly agree with you, the broader point you're trying to make about getting your story out. I mean, we talk about this in this podcast a lot in terms of public narrative and public leadership. But there's that old campaign adage: "Never interrupt your enemies when they're completely fucking up." I think that's the quote.
Yeah.
Verbatim. Even if you were to try and put your story out, you'd be struggling from a communication strategy to have any success right now, because the journalists would be just so obsessed with the insanity of what's going on inside the Conservative Party.
Yeah, well, look, that is true. Yeah, and don't interrupt your enemies has that has been working pretty well, but when they're faced with someone who's less of a known quantity as like Sunak, in terms of like you can't describe Sunak in the same terms as you could with Johnson. Like he's not the same kind of party animal who just has who just looks feckless and reckless. So that means you're getting to a point where if you're just being, if the presentation of the Labour leader under the prime ministership of Truss is that he's the sensible guy who is competent, etc. But you're faced with a prime minister who's also presenting himself as sensible and competent. Like it's not a great story to tell. Where you're coming then to an eventual election where you're just going, who's the more sensible and who's the more competent, and on whose terms? Because if the sensible competence that he has cultivated in terms of an image, it's sometimes defined in relatively conservative terms because Truss and Johnson were making such a mess of the economy and of managing government and society, even on their own on conservative standards. So he's trying to move into that area where I've become more interested in recent times on the dynamics of persuasion, and the idea that you don't kind of just try to go to where you think the public might be at, because the public moves as well. Is the idea that you actually appeal and show a level of leadership, and I worry that it is incumbent upon a Labour Party to show leadership on those areas where, especially where the Conservatives have been messing up, but also areas where, like as a movement, Labour has a responsibility to those communities who are getting left behind or who are discriminated against. And if they're being a little bit indulgent on, the kind of xenophobic attacks that the Tories are engaging in and not calling them out in it, or are trying to talk tough on immigration, or not following through on the kind of provision of resources and opportunities in working class communities, or not being honest about what a disaster Brexit is, and especially this version of it that they're indulging. They have to show leadership too. And I understand that there's maybe a tendency to think that let's just keep going where we're going. But what happens when you get into power? And then you actually want to do all of these things, and you haven't told the public, you haven't brought them with you from a campaigning base. I worry that there's a potential for another loss of trust. And they have really talented people within the Labour front bench, and Starmer himself is very talented. I don't know if they're doing enough to let us all know that, and especially people within the UK, but like also the rest of us outside. He's kind of been a little bit unclear when it comes to issues around Northern Ireland too, and like Johnson had been trying to put together an amnesty for British soldiers, who had been engaging in human rights abuses or shot people in Northern Ireland and else. Well, it was also linked to what's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. But Starmer has been pretty kind of supportive of those kind of measures as well. He hasn't really engaged that substantively on Northern Ireland yet. He's kind of taken it, whereas like the Conservatives have been. The Conservatives have not been objective, though they're supposed to be as a government, in terms of being even-handed between the nationalist and unionist communities in Northern Ireland. And previous Labour governments had been very good on that, and they'd upheld their side of the bargain. Starmer's kind of floundered a bit too, and I just kind of worry that there's maybe, I don't know if it's a dynamic of what handlers are doing or what kind of advice he's getting, where people think it's very clever to triangulate like that without showing leadership. And I think that politics is polarized and coarsened to such a degree. You kind of need to show a degree of honesty, and you need to show leadership, especially in a Labour Party.
Here, and on that we do. We are in furious agreement, and at some point, yes, Keir and his leadership, he's going to have to front up and actually sort of define who he is and what he values and what he wants for Britain. David, once again, Gaurav for coming on the show. It's been great to see you, and we appreciate your insights into what's going on in the UK. It's not easy to unpack the chaos that has been the last couple of months, so we really value your time. And hopefully the next time we catch up, it won't be over Zoom, but it might be face-to-face, maybe having a pint in Keogh's.
Yeah, that would be great. You come back anytime. It's great to see you.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on.